Here's another Marion McPartland. This is shared with George Shearing, who's also a great British piano player. And this is early Savoy, 12,016. And I think this might be from some 10-inch stuff if I had to think about it. And this has a later cover as well with a scene. I think it's Trafalgar Square. I didn't pull it, but I'm not sure. George Shearing has quite a few releases here in America. Here's one with the Montgomery brothers, Monk Buddy and Wes. And the Montgomery brothers are, of course, out of Indianapolis. Wes is one of the great guitar players of all time. This is Shearing playing with those guys on the Jazzland imprint. And Jazzland, of course, is Orrin Keep News and Bill Grauer. And of all the labels here in America, I think Jazzland Riverside probably is the most aggressive in giving us some cutting-edge British jazz music. Savoy does some quite a lot as well, not as much as Riverside nor as cutting edge. This is Ronnie Ball, another piano player. He's a great piano player, and he ends up playing on a lot of great Savoy sessions, kind of filling Hank Jones's chair, playing with Kenny Clark and Wendell Marshall. On this, he's playing with Kenny Clark and Wendell Marshall, with Ted Brown and Willie Dennis. And if memory serves, those guys are both UK guys as well. Nice record, rare old Savoy. It's a tough record to come by, to be honest. But Ronnie was a great player and certainly is worthy of remembrance. Here's another Marion McPartland. These got somehow mixed up. The cats must have mixed them up. This is Marion McPartland on the Argo label at the London House. The magnificent Marion McPartland. I love that album cover. And this is on the great Argo label out of Chicago. And if the London House is in Chicago, it's not there anymore. I'm guessing it probably is, being on the Argo label. But again, I'm not sure. And Marion also has records on Capitol, where she really starts hitting the mainstream and has quite a bit of success, as does George Shearing. Those two both cross over into the mainstream. And again, on Capitol, George Shearing's working with Peggy Lee and having quite a lot of success and sold really well, which is great for him, no question about it. So now one of the real risky guys that comes from England via Jamaica is a guy by the name of Joe Harriott. And him and Dizzy Reece, who I'll talk about next, were both Jamaican born, were part of the scene down there, emigrate to England, and start their careers over there. And Harriott had some crossover to America. By no means is he as popular as the Dexter Gordons and John Coltrane's, but he was actually a very forward-thinking player. This is Southern Horizons, and I apologize for the ink pen on her face. Some previous owner had a child who must have got a whooping for that one. This is Jazzland number 37, and Jazzland again is a sister label, initially a budget label of Riverside, and they put some of the more experimental, edgy stuff on Jazzland. After initially trying to kind of reissue titles on there, they kind of abandoned that and go to just putting between the cracks stuff, as it were. This is Freeform, Joe Harriott Quintet. And again, Harriott really delves into the avant-garde and the free sound of things. And this record especially is very challenging the frontiers of the jazz palette. He's a big name in the free jazz circles. So if you're into the avant-garde and the post-bop modernity of free jazz and Ornette Coleman and that whole era, Harriott was doing that really well. And I actually find this record quite stimulating. Certainly not something I can listen to every day, but he does present it wonderfully and has some interesting thoughts that you can feel come across. This is from my friends in Jazz in Britain, a modern label in England right now that's looking for vintage jazz dates and issuing them. And this is Joe Harriott Live 6869, Chronology, I believe it's called. And they gifted me this. and I did a little review on it for him. This is a couple of years ago now, probably. Not too many copies were printed, I don't think. Matt Parker wanted you to have this. 14.7 on 2020. So, nice record. It's got good, decent sound quality for sure. Definitely someone worth seeking out. So now the next big name I want to mention, like Joe Harriott, is Dizzy Reece. Again, a Jamaican-born black man. Emigrates to England. And of course, being Commonwealth, that migration is a fairly easy move to make, unlike moving to America, which is more convoluted for a Jamaican. This is with Donald Bernard Taylor on Blue Note number 4006, 1959. This probably came out. Dizzy's a great trumpet player. If memory serves, this first record was actually recorded for Transition out of Boston. And I think it was Tom Wilson, was the name of the guy who founded Transition. And the label didn't last very long. It was a tough thing to make money in jazz in the 50s, especially when you're doing kind of edgier, less commercially charged stuff. It wasn't going to be an easy road to hoe. 4033, we'll do 4023 first. It's Star Bright. Another Dizzy Reece on Blue Note. Probably 6 months later with Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, Hank Mobley, and Art Taylor. So he gets quite a fantastic group to back him here. And these were recorded in New York as far as I remember. And then this is 4033 sounding off. And this might be my favorite British jazz record. It's got Doug Watkins on it, his Transition friend, with Art Taylor and Walter Bishop Jr. on the piano. Just a great record. And hearing his balladry, he really has this wonderful tone and a clear, bright, but enchanting and welcoming sound. It's not bristling with some of the frustration and density of a guy like Lee Morgan. It's very much an open invitation and comforting sound that Dizzy Reece has, especially on his ballads. Really fell in love with that. And then this is from probably 1960, 59, Changing the Jazz at Buckingham Palace, featuring Dizzy Reece and Tubby Hayes. And Tubby Hayes is another great British player. This was one of the toughest Savoy records to come across. I searched and searched, and I finally found one in Italy, of all places. I can't get the jacket to pull out. Tubby's another one of those great UK players. There was kind of a scene in London with Tubby Hayes, Ronnie Scott, Dizzy Reece. This has Dickie Howden, Harry South, Billy Iden, and Pete Elderfeed. And that's, it looks like this is all one session by the looks of it. The men, the music, and the different lineups. I can't remember if this is those two playing together or they're separate sides, to be honest. Tubby Hayes. No, they are. It's a separate side each. And so Dizzy Reece is playing with Terry Shannon, Lenny Bush, and Phil Seaman. A whole totally different rhythm section. Probably this material predates its release, I'm going to guess. And I don't think Savoy Records probably recorded these. I'm guessing they're probably licensing them out of England and putting that stuff out. This is a tough record to find nowadays by two legends of the UK scene. And I hope I'm doing these guys some justice. Like I said, I'm by no means an expert at these European guys. I just don't know them the same way. And the European guys, they have an element of soul, and there's a strain, and there's some of what the black players in America have, the white European players can also access, and that's oppression and tyranny, and the world wars were incredible markers on a man's life. When you lose your dad, when you lose your home, your goats, your whatever, when your home is taken from you, when your land is occupied, when you see your cities bombed, the death tolls were so incredible. World War II leaves an indelible mark on those people and gives them a soul that's relatable in some senses to the black experiences in America. And I think it was that empathy of those Europeans that allowed them to treat the blacks so well when they came over there, from sharing an understanding of how difficult oppression is, that allowed them to kind of coexist and they'll play together and find common ground that I think a lot of the black players had a hard time replicating in their American experiences. And there's a lot of stories of black players that went over there for a tour with no intent of moving there. But after having been there for a few weeks, couldn't stomach the thought of going back to the oppression and the racism and the lack of respect. And suddenly I'm being treated not just like an equal, but as a star, as a legend, I'm being seen as someone who's great, not as someone who's lesser than in my own backyard all the time. So there's quite a few examples of guys who went to Europe and after a few weeks just decided to stay. And some guys stayed for 6 months, some guys stayed for 2 years, some guys stayed for 20 years, and there's always kind of a longing for home. But that relationship between the European white players and the North American black players who came over only strengthens the grassroots jazz movements that were happening in those countries. And it was actually the war that brings a lot of jazz to Europe, the GIs and the spread of the Allied radio. Even the Nazis embraced jazz at one point. So jazz is a pretty strong foothold in Europe already. And so when these guys start coming over in the 40s and the 50s and the war's kind of happening around them, and it's all very much developing a bond between jazz and the Europeans, the black musicians who come over there. It gives the white European players some credentials when they could say, I played with Don Byas, I played with Bird, I played with Francis Boland and Kenny Clark, I played with Coleman Hawkins. When you can name drop some of those great North American players as a European bass player or a European drummer or pianist, you suddenly have a resume that gives you a little bit of extra credential. And so the black guys came across, it strengthened the European players, validated a lot of them as being great players. And the more Americans that stayed, the stronger the European jazz scene became. And the European public latched onto jazz in a way that the American audiences had forsaken jazz by this point and were moving away from it. And the Europeans were only getting more invested and had stronger relationships with jazz at this point. So it's interesting to see how jazz grows and graphs, and of course the same thing happens in Japan with artists like Sadao Watanabe and the great Toshiko Akiyoshi. Players like that in Japan were also products of the end of the war and the GIs being there and jazz records being proliferated around the country. Jazz has this magnetism. Great jazz has a pull and a draw and an alluring sense to it that's very compelling. And again, I don't know European jazz like maybe I should, but I only really know the American labels. And we got a lot more to come here. But I still feel I can talk about it okay. By no means am I an expert. Next guy I want to talk to you about real quick is Chris Barber. Chris Barber is a UK big band guy. And if memory serves correct, I've been saying that a lot lately, haven't I? I feel like making these trading cards, I'm up to like 170 now, 175. Making these trading cards is putting so much information in my brain that a lot of the information that's in there is like jarbled around right now. I'm like, okay, so is memory serving me correctly? I'm not sure. But Chris Barber was a big band guy in England and was a big part of the scene. I think the other guy was Ted Heath, who I don't have anything by. Another guy I don't have nothing by is Peter Ind. I do have him as a sideman on a few records, and he's a great bass player. But I didn't pull any of his side work out. I had nothing of him as a leader. Another great European that came over in the 50s and made quite an impact was the great Victor Feldman. And another great piano player. This is on Contemporary. Contemporary is another one of those labels that seem to take chances on Europeans. Of course, Contemporary is very much a white label, which would make some sense whether this is what they were signing anyway. Victor was a great player. He played the vibes as well as the piano really well. And he comes over, does this record with Scott LaFaro and Stan Levy. Outstanding stuff. This is more of a big band quartet septet, so it's got multiple sessions on it. And Victor's a great player. He's great enough that Miles Davis wants to play with him and does so like in 62 or so. And then he wants to hire Victor Feldman for his group, and Feldman declined. He's like, this is not what I want to do. I want to be doing my own thing, whether it was Miles' personality or musical choices or whatever. He turned down one of the best paying jobs in jazz to do his own thing. This is Victor Feldman, piano and vibes. Again, this is on Riverside. Again, showing you Riverside and Jazzland really do a lot with the European players as they come over. And he has a great legacy. Feldman records a long time, makes a lot of great music. Shows up with Simon in a lot of places. This is Pub Crawling with Jimmy Duker. And Jimmy Duker, if I remember, is a Scottish guy. And I think he's a trumpet player. I hope I'm not wrong about that. I'm pretty sure he's a trumpet player here. And this is on the Contemporary label as well. Probably 1956 or 7. Nice little cover, Pub Crawling. And I'm not sure if he was as much a part of the London scene as those other guys were, being from Scotland. But all the same, he's a guy worthy of mention. Now, this is another George Shearing record that I missed. This is on Savoy. And again, this is a 2 10-inches. One side is the Red Norvo Trio, which I think is with Mingus and Tal Farlow than it is. And the other side is with George Shearing, Marjorie Hyman, Chuck Wayne, John Levy, and Denzel Bass, the great drummer. So again, this is probably a 10-inch on Savoy from early 50s, and they repackage it here, number 12093, which puts it about 1959. So Shearing has a lot of big body of work. Two more guys that are really exciting players. Don Rendell is a fantastic sax player. This is again on Jazzland, the Riverside Orange Keep News. And he's playing with Graham Bond, John Birch, Tony Archer, and Phil Canora. I know John Birch and Graham Bond are fairly big names as well. I have nothing by them as a leader. But this is, again, Riverside putting out a great UK player, licensing some stuff, and putting Don Rendell out for the American audiences to consume. And Rendell, of course, has a fairly long career. He makes some great records into the 60s and 70s. And I know he's one of the leaders of the UK jazz scene into that era. This is also on Jazzland Riverside. And this features Tubby Hayes and Ronnie Scott. And Tubby Hayes and Ronnie Scott were both great players. And of course, Ronnie Scott ends up opening a club in London. And it's one of the premier jazz clubs in the world in terms of who played there and the quality of jazz that was there on a nightly basis. Ronnie Scott's was a legendary club. And it might even still be open. Someone will need to remind me if it is or not. Of course, he's passed quite a long time ago at this point. And Tubby Hayes is also, like I said, a great player. So the Rendell, Joe Harriott, Dizzy Reece, Tubby Hayes, Ronnie Scott, those five are, to me, the center of the London kind of quasi-hard bop scene, into free jazz elements and some avant-garde even at times. But those five are all the cutting edge in terms of what was coming out of the UK at that point. I don't think any of those guys, maybe Dizzy Reece did, spent prolonged times in America. You know, I think they were here at times for short visits, but I don't recall any of them moving to America or reading ever. I could be wrong again. Again, I'm not an expert here. Another great little piano player and arranger composer is a guy by the name of Ralph Sharon. This is on the Bethlehem label. What a wonderful cover. Smoking the cigarette. And that's not actually a cigarette, that's a Liberty stick. Liberty torch. I was watching this documentary that my friend, drawing a blank right now. He owns a record store in the Newcastle area. It's just south of Newcastle. And he recommended to me this documentary series by a great British documentary filmmaker, Adam. It's early in the morning. I'm not pulling up names like I should be right now. But in order to get women to smoke cigarettes, at Easter Day Parade, they have a bunch of women smoking. The press takes photographs. And It's from the women's suffrage movement. Men had said women smoking is taboo. So these women claimed through these advertisements or releases in the newsprint that they were smoking as a way to resist male dominance. These were liberty torches. They weren't cigarettes. And it led to women smoking cigarettes and opening that market up to the cigarette companies. Outstanding stuff. Neil Bilton, sorry, I couldn't think of your name for a second there. But cigarettes, it's just funny that it's going to always be in my mind now when I see a cigarette. There's Mr. and Mrs. Sue and Ralph Sharon, also in Bethlehem. Nice records, not too expensive. And this is Ralph Sharon and Friends on Argo. And so that's the UK scene from an American jazz collector's perspective. There's got to be so many names out there that escape me and are beyond my comprehension. But McParlin, Sharon, Harriott, Rendell Hayes, Scott, Ronnie Ball, Reece, Feldman, Chris Barber, Jimmy Duker, Annie Ross, Peter Ind, and Ted Heath. Those seem to be the nucleus of the scene and the names that had the most exposure in that era. We're going to move on to France now. And France has a lot of great talent as well. And we'll just dive into that right off the bat here. And we're going to start with the Miles Davis, also show La Chaffaut, something about Lift to the Scaffold. And on this is the great player Barney Weiland. He's a saxophonist, and I got nothing of him as a leader, I'll be honest. I've known of him for a long time because of his work on this, and he's a beautiful player, and he dovetails nicely with Miles. I'd like to find some more Barney Weiland, especially that early one called Jump or something like that. It's an action word on the cover. I'd like to find that record, but it's just not something that's on my radar very often as I'm collecting, especially when I'm collecting the labels I'm collecting. But again, when I'm searching Discogs, I'm often looking through the entire jazz catalogs, and these records just aren't available here in America. My friend Jean-Michel turned me on to Guy Lafitte, another wonderful European, Parisian, if I recall, Frenchman. Guy Lafitte is a wonderful tone player. He played with all the greats, and Jean-Michel laid it down for me who some of the guys he played with were. And if I remember, it's guys like Coleman Hawkins and some pretty big name guys. And he actually turned down some opportunities to tour with some of these Black Americans because he wanted to do his own thing. And but he's got a fairly large discography. I was gifted both of these by Jean-Michel. Again, thank you, my friend. Great listens. These are probably 70s or 80s pressings on Black and Blue. And definitely will grab more Guy Lafitte going forward as my collection starts to grow again. And it's been kind of stagnant these last 4 months because of COVID and not being employed. I can't be spending money on records, and the records aren't getting any cheaper. So I just can't justify dropping $60 on a record right now. Just can't do it. I got bills to pay. I'm just trying to break even every month right now with what I got coming in. Speaking of that, my friend Michael Vasallo, who is a friend of mine in New York, he heard me say I needed to get back in shape and lose some weight because I'm getting fat. He's offered to pay for my health club membership, and I want to extend an eternal thanks to him. I go tomorrow for my check-in and sign-up. There was a week waiting period right now, probably because of COVID and other factors. But I get to go tomorrow for the first time, so I'm excited about that. And thank you, Michael Vasallo. What a blessing this channel is, and you guys helping out and supporting. It's really an amazing experience. And sometimes my wife and my brother looks on, it's like, they're paying for your membership. I'm like, yeah, I'm so blessed. So blessed. And I do need to lose weight. I'll be 50 this year. I can't be going in at 50 at 270 pounds. So I got to lose 40 pounds the next year. So part of it was eating healthy, part of it's portion sizes, but having energy and exercise and just having more vivacity, it'd be good for me to get back in shape to the best of my abilities. Sasha Distel is kind of a folk guitarist who has some circles with the jazz players. Here's playing with John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet. This is on the Atlantic record number 1267. And Sasha Distel, he did that Raindrops Drop Falling on My Head. He had a big hit with that. I don't think he was original, he covers it, but nice record, nice John Lewis. And John Lewis always wanted to kind of graft the North American jazz sound with the European sounds anyway. So he did that pretty well. Andre Hodier is another pianist out of France, out of Paris, I believe. This is the Paris scene. This is on Savoy, number 12113. Also on Savoy, this is number 12104. I don't see the number written on here for some reason. But on this one, he's playing with a large ensemble. But on this one, he's playing with some great American players. Donald Byrd, Idris Suleiman, Frank Rehak, Bobby Jasper, the Belgian, Hal McCusick, Eddie Koss is on this, George Vivier, Annie Ross, and Bobby Donaldson. So it's a pretty big affair. And it's a really solid record. He's arranging, he's doing some composing, if I recall. And like I said, he also plays the piano. So another one, Andre Hodier, another great name to keep in mind. Another French piano player is a guy by the name of Bernard Pfeiffer. Here's a 10-inch of his on Emersy, and this is a 12-inch on Emersy from the early mid-50s. Another fine player who tends to lend himself more to a more rigid kind of classical sound, less blues in his playing. But again, the blues is not something you can really fake. You have to have it in your soul to do it. Michel Legrand, this is a pretty famous record of a concert he throws in Paris. Oh, I was in New York, sorry. With a lot of the greats of this time. Dizzy Gillespie, Benny Goodman, Earl Hines, Count Basie, John Lewis, Fats Waller, Duke Ellington. Those are the songs and the musicians on this. It's pretty crazy. Ernie Royal, Art Farmer, Donald Byrd, Joe Wilder, Jimmy Cleveland, Quill Woods, Powell, Tel Macero, Don Elliott, Milt Hinton, O.C. Johnson, Coltrane, Jerome Richardson, Miles Davis, Barry Galbraith, Betty Gleeman. It's Bill Evans, Paul Chambers. It's just a who's who for this concert. And Michel Legrand does some kind of artsy. And I'm not going to say too much about him. I don't really know him too well beyond that concert record. And another important Parisian Frenchman is, of course, Stéphane Grappelli, who plays violin, and he plays jazz on the violin like nobody's business. And he kind of comes to fame with the Hot Club of France group with the great Django Reinhardt, which is a great segue into Belgium. We're going to move up through Flanders and cross over into Belgium right now. And there's 4 Belgians I really want to talk about right now. I do want to mention Martel Solal, another French pianist who was of Algerian Jewish descent. He was another great Frenchman. Pierre Michelot, another great Frenchman. Again, people I don't have records by. But the French do have a great jazz legacy. But Belgium, for a small nation in the lowlands, Django Reinhardt's one of the great legends, and probably the first great European jazz star. He's one of the first guys that really has his own sound, and it's when you hear Django, you kind of know it. And it's sometimes called gypsy jazz. I'm not sure how people are in favor of that terminology at this point. I still see it listed on his Wikipedia pages and places. But I think I renamed it as bistro jazz. Less offensive if someone's offended by the term gypsy. He had a deformed hand. It was from polio or from fire. But he had a chord and play in a unique manner. But he was such a fluid storyteller and just one of the most beautiful players. And him and Stéphane Grappelli create the group, the Hot Club of France. And they play together for a number of years. He tours Europe. He's working with Coleman Hawkins, a lot of the greats. And then he passes really young. But his legacy is undoubtedly one of the greats of not just the European jazz scene, but of the entire jazz scene. Django really climbs above the fray. This is on the Period label, some more Django. And some of these artists I have more records, but I just didn't pull everything. I have more Django, but that's all I pulled for now. Another great Belgian who plays guitar and harmonica is Toots Thielman. I love this record, again on Riverside. So again, you see that there's a chance being taken by the Riverside family. This is just such a great record. Pepper Adams is on this, Kenny Drew, Wilbur Ware, and Art Taylor around with the rhythm section. He plays guitar on some, he plays harmonica on some. And you say jazz harmonica? And I say, yeah. I have another record of his on the ABC label, which came a few years later. I didn't pull it. He probably has a few other American releases as well. And he lives into a ripe old age. and was a star of a lot of the European jazz festivals. You can see those concerts at like the North Sea Jazz Festival or whatever you have. There's lots of jazz festivals in Europe. He was a guy that you would see starring at a lot of those events. Another great Belgian player was René Thomas, another guitar player. So all three of those guys were guitar players. Real sophisticated, elegant sound. He's got some of the Django Parisian cafe bistro feel. He's also got a modern, aggressive tack and some bebop sensibility with some of his single note lines. I love this record. I played it a lot at my gigs. I think it's with American players. Teddy Kodak's on the bass from Boston. Albert Tutti Heath from Philly. J.R. Montrose is on some of the tracks. So yeah, that's pretty much an American group. This is probably recorded here. Great record. Love that stuff. And then Bobby Jaspar, the fourth Belgian I wanted to talk about today, is a great flautist, alto sax player. He made quite an imprint in the American jazz scene for a little bit. And I think he was probably aided somewhat by a name that sounded American. Some of the names of some of the European guys sound so foreign to American record buyers, but Bobby Jaspar, you'd never know. And I think people are that fickle here in this country. But these are two records either for Prestige, probably 59, Flute Souffle, awesome stuff. That's an original pressing of that. And this is Flute Flight with Herbie Mann, Bobby Jaspar. Those are both Prestige originals that aren't too tough to come by. You know, Prestige 7000 series stuff is getting pretty rare, but those aren't too tough to find. And I do want to mention Francie Boland here. I could have pulled some of the stuff with Kenny Clark. Francie Boland, I believe, was a piano player, and he works with Kenny Clark in that Kenny Clark Francie Boland band for a long time. And that group would always house some of the great Americans in Europe at the time, plus an array of some of the best European players played in that big band of Kenny Clark's and Francie Boland. And he was a Belgian as well. And like I said, I don't have nothing him as a leader. I got quite a bit of stuff with him as Clark Boland, big band. We're going to move on to Holland now. And the other low-lying country, I'm of Dutch descent myself. And the first guy I want to mention out of Holland is Matt Matthews. And he's an accordion player. And I think being European gives you a license to say, you know what, I want to play the accordion in a jazz sensibility. And he plays his ass off. And these two records on Dawn are both outstanding. They got some bistro jazz sensibility to them, some Django Reinhardt, some eating a baguette on the Seine with a fancy beret and a scooter to boot. Like, they got that kind of a chicness to them. But make no mistake about it, these are jazz records. And if you look at the sidemen on this record alone, Oscar Pettiford, Kenny Clark, Joe Puma, Herbie Mann, Gigi Grice, Art Farmer, Dick Katz, Julius Watkins. And black, 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 white, 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 black, black. So it's a pretty mixed group even playing with Matt Matthews. So it shows you that all these great American players were intrigued by the accordion playing Dutchman and were happy to accompany him on his records at the Dawn label. And then when he first comes over in early 50s to England, to America, his first group was with Herbie Mann. It's actually called the New York Jazz Quartet. And I love all the members of this group. I love Joe Puma. I love Herbie Mann. I love Matt Matthews. And I love Whitey Mitchell. And this is, I think, the second one right there. And these were both reissued on Savoy, who bought these early Elektra. This is on the Elektra label. Elektra only has so many jazz titles, like a dozen or so maybe. And a lot of them show up in the Savoy sequence in the late 12100s with different names and titles. I think one of them is called Herbie Mann Goes Jungle or Tropical or something like that. That's this record, you know. And this record, there's an Art Blakey Jazz Messenger on Elektra that Savoy reissues as well in that same time period. And so he's one of the great Dutch players. He stays in America for 5-6 years, goes back to Holland, stays in the music business over there for a long time. I think he does come back to America again at one point. But he made his mark and did his thing. This is Rita Reece, another Dutch singer, fantastic voice, love her sound. And this record, part of it's recorded with the Jazz Messengers. If I remember, it's with the Jazz Messengers of the Johnny Griffin era, maybe Jackie McLean. I don't say. But I think this is in 57, 58, 57, I think it is. I think it's that group with Spanky DeBrest and Johnny Griffin in that era. And then but she has a second record here on Epic, which is of course the cousin label to Columbia. And this has with Tom Disselveld and his orchestra and Jan Cordovina and his orchestra, both Dutch band leaders, I'm guessing. And then this one also mentions the side that doesn't have the Jazz Messengers has the Wes Ilkin combo. Wes Ilkin. And he's a pretty renowned Dutch band leader from what I know. And this is Herbie Mann with the Wes Ilkin trio. And this is on Epic as well. And so that's the Holland Dutch players from the Netherlands that I'm aware of. Great players, of course. And I'm proud of my own Dutch heritage. So let's move on now to Scandinavia. And first and foremost, you got to talk about Kai Winding. Kai is a fantastic trombonist. He comes across as early as the 40s, if I remember. And I think he's playing with Stan Ken in one of his earlier groups, one of his big bands. And then he's such a great player with such a smooth melodic sound. Columbia hires him. He makes a number of records as a leader on Columbia. But then they pair him up with J.J. Johnson. And the J.J. Johnson Kai Winding records of the mid-50s are outstanding. And the body of work of J.J. and Kai is so big that you would think that they were together for years. But they were really only together for a couple years, went their separate ways. They regrouped for that early Impulse record that comes out on Impulse, but they weren't an entity that whole time in the 50s at all. But they do have a large body of work that was all recorded in a rather short period of time. And he's one of the biggest stars of European descent, Kai Winding. And yeah, he must have lived in America for a long time. He records for Columbia for most of the 50s, ends up getting signed by Verve when Creed Taylor comes over to Verve, and he makes a long string of records at the Verve label. This Kai Winding here is on Roost. It's a 10-inch 408. And Jerry Mulligan, Brew Moore, Max Roach, George Wellington, and Curly Russell. A great lineup. And this is probably by 1952, 53, pretty early. And Winding's a pretty legendary player. It deserves a lot of recognition. Max Brule, fantastic player. I think Max is a trumpet player. No, that's Jordan Reed. I think he's a sax player. Yeah, he plays baritone, actually. With Ben Oxen, Jorgen Reed, who we have right here. Jorgen Reed, a trumpet player. Eric Moselholm, Leif Soyberg, William Schopf. So another Danish. I think he goes on to become an architect, if memory serves me correct on that. And again, Jordan Reed. These are both on the Emersy label. Emersy was also pretty willing to use European licensed stuff and to put it out, and I have no qualms with that whatsoever. 36099 probably puts us around 1959-60. It doesn't list the bandmates, unfortunately. But again, this is a nice record by a great Danish trumpet player. And then you can't talk about Holland and not talk about Niels Henning Orsted Pedersen, one of the great bass players, kind of in the Scott LaFaro camp, with a lot of clean, flowing, melodic, counter-melodic lines and real percussive tact, and predominant in the mix as well. You'll always hear Scott LaFaro. You'll always hear N-Hop. And this is a Kenny Drew record that he's a sideman on. And I got Niels Henning on a number of records as a sideman, but nothing as a leader. I don't really know what he did as a leader. And then Lars Gulen is a baritonist from Sweden, I believe. Yep. And a fantastic tone. We've been listening to Lars Gulen here on Atlantic, number 1246. Baritone sax, I think it's called. And great cover. This is with the Moretone Singers on Emersy. And Emersy gave him a couple titles. This is Lars Gulen as well. This one's early 3612, 3659. So one of the great Swedish players. And then once again, we're going to see Jazzland, Riverside, take a chance on some European players with the Werner Rosengren Swedish Jazz Quartet. And this has some names I'm going to have a struggle even trying to say. Bernd Rosengren, Lars Werner, Sun Spangberg, and Torborn Holkrantz. With Lars Werner and Kjell Samuelsson. I'm probably butchered those names, but this is on Jazz on number 26. A pretty tough record to come by, to be honest. I'm sure you don't see it very often. You don't see it posted very often. So Riverside has a pretty strong legacy of putting out the Europeans. This is a Blue Note 10-inch from probably a 53, 5019 called the Pole Winners. It's got the Swinging Swedes and the Cool Britons. Pretty rare 10-inch. This is an original Deep Groove 10-inch. A pretty rare record. And the players on this, the Swedes have Rolf Eriksson, pretty big name, Aka Persson, Putte Wickman, Arne Domerus, Karl-Henrik Noren, Lars Gulen, Ulf Lind, just a whole string of Swedes. And then the British guys have Kenny Baker, Gordon Longhorn, Henry McKenzie, Ronnie Scott, Victor Feldman, Ronnie Chamberlain, Johnny Dankworth, Ralph Sharon, Charlie Short, Jack Parnell, Jimmy Duker's on some of these, Johnny Dankworth again, Don Rendell. So you're getting Tony Kinsey. So a lot of the great British players are on that Blue Note 10-inch. And that's a pretty tough 10-inch to find. And that's on from Seymour's record mark on Wabash in Chicago, which my friend Scott Baldwin told me that Seymour's is what became the Jazz record mark. That was bought out by Bob Kochner, and that's what became that great Chicago record institution. Next, we're going to talk about German. And Andre Previn is a German by birth. He lived kind of all over the world. His parents were involved with the Hollywood film studios, so he ends up living most of his life, at least part of his life, in California, and ends up being part of the great scene at Contemporary, working with Shelly Manne and Red Mitchell. And these records are all fairly famous, sold pretty well. And Previn can delve between classical and jazz with the best of them. He's a fairly well-versed player, possibly a little less blues in him, kind of like a Bernard Pfeiffer than some of these guys, but he's definitely something you have to mention. And I also Andre Previn was French, but turns out he was born in, I think, in Berlin. And he might have had some African descent. I know he's a Jew, if I remember. Una Hip is on Blue Notes, and she was a great German piano player that was friends with Alfred Line at Blue Note. And she gets to come over and record some stuff for Blue Note in 53, 54, this 10-inch, and these three albums, Hickory House, and it was Zoot Sims. And the Zoot Sims one is probably the most famous of that bunch. But once you discover Yuta, she's a beautiful player, very lyrical, long flowing hair, beautiful woman. She disappears from the scene. She makes these records. They were well acclaimed and reviewed, but I remember once too, I can't remember if she was raising a kid or something, but she just kind of walks away from it. And Blue Note collectors kind of go crazy for Yuta Hip records. They're very, very desirable. This is a German brother by the name of Steve Kuhn, and this is him with Gary McFarlane, the great arranger producer. And then here it is, the Rolf and Joachim Kuhn Quartet. These are both on Impulse, and they're both a little bit more modern and have some different edges to them. And of course, Germany also produced some great talent that we're not talking about here. Guys like Albert Mangelsdorf and Peter Bronsman, who are more on the free and real aggressive side of jazz. Not something that I spend a lot of time listening to. They're both legends, and I know of them, but I haven't collected any of their work. George Wallington, I could have pulled a lot of his stuff, but I only pulled these two. He was an Italian-born, I think Sicilian-born Italian that moved to America at a very young age to New York. So he's barely a European, and he changes his name to George Wallington, which you couldn't sound more British than that. You don't sound American, buddy. You sound like a Brit with the name George Wallington. Marvelous, darling. Where's my monocle? That's a monocle name. You gotta have a monocle to be called Sir George Wallington. But he's a great player. He shows up in a lot of stuff at Prestige and the late 50s, early 60s. He's a fairly omnipresent guy with a lot of recordings, actually. Wallington's a big part of the whole scene in New York at that point. And again, his heritage, he's deserving of some mention. And that's part of the thing, is that heritage-wise, there's a lot of guys that have legacy and heritage back in Europe. You know, a lot of the white cats were first-generation immigrants or immigrants themselves at a young age, but it's a very different history than the Black American jazz players who came from the Jim Crow South and the great movement up to the north for jobs and up into the Rust Belt cities. It's a very different history of the whites versus the blacks. This is Joe Zawinul, fantastic player. This is the only thing I have by him as a leader, honestly. Quite a bit of his work as a sideman, but he's of Austrian descent, and he's definitely was worth a mention. He shows up a little bit later in the conversation here. He's more of a mid-60s guy into the 70s, and of course he plays with all the greats in the 70s. He's a legend without any question. And then Gabor Szabo, Hungarian, kind of a Django Reinhardt descendant. He plays some gypsy jazz, being, of course, of Romani descent himself. I could have pulled out a stack of his records. I love and really loved him back in my LSD days, because he does some kind of psychedelic guitar jazz stuff that was really fun to hear the bells and the incense and all the what have yous going on, all the bells and the whistles. So I do want to mention one other Hungarian player, a guy named Attila Zoller, another great guitar player who taught New York for a long time. I have one of his records, but it's down in my Fusion era section, which isn't sorted. I need to get down on my hands and knees and finding it. But he's another guy that's worthy of mention. So that wraps up my episode today on the great European players that made it in America on some level, at least on the wax. And I'm sure I missed a lot. And I'm sure there's a lot of great players in Europe that didn't make it here. You know, and I'm sure there's a lot of great European players who played as a sideman a lot with even the great black players who went to Europe. I know there's a lot of great French pianists and bass players, and I've seen a lot of names. I know I missed a lot of guys, but the guideline I kind of used here was, did they make records here in America? And this is the guys that did, and I'm sure I even missed a few of those, but I hope y'all enjoyed this episode. I did the best I could with this. Again, I'm hesitant to do things that people ask if I don't really know them very well. But I know this kind of well enough, at least from this perspective. And like I said, I certainly couldn't speak from the perspective of a guy living in Copenhagen who witnessed all the great Americans there, living there, and then the great local guys that were playing with them. I couldn't begin to mention half of those names, quarter of those names. And the European jazz scene is immense, and it's still much stronger than the American scene is today. You know, jazz has a real strong foothold in Europe, thankfully. So, last thing I want to say is, if you're from one of these countries, tell me who your jazz legends are, especially from this era. But I don't mind if you suggest even a couple names from the current era, just to educate, the viewers and the listeners, the people who read the comments, and myself for that matter. I'm not buying much right now, but I will be buying again at some point. So, cheers to all the European people who watch this channel. Hope you guys all enjoyed that. I hope I mentioned some of your favorites. I'm sure I missed some. That's part of the deal. If you want to support the channel, please go to my Patreon page. Please subscribe if you haven't. Click the bell for alerts if you haven't done that. There's a merchandise page also in the description. If you want to grab some great Jazz Shepherd hoodies and merchandise, please do that to support the channel. It's always appreciated. Y'all stay strong, stay safe. My wife tested positive last week. Didn't have any symptoms, but she cleared protocols now, so she's back to work. So thanks everyone for your positive thoughts. We'll talk to you all soon. I'll be back in a couple days. Peace. Good morning, everybody. It's a Tuesday here in the Midwest. The cold snap of last weekend's kind of lifted. We're getting back now around 5, 6 degrees. Should get up to like 25 degrees today. That's Fahrenheit. So, we're getting closer to zero. For those of you Celsius folks in the modern world, we're still here in caveman world with inches, feet, pounds, and Fahrenheit. It's a strange choice, honestly, for us to still be on the imperial system, especially in light of the fact you fought a revolution against the nation whose system of measure you still use. But I know there's a lot of infrastructure costs to change all that stuff. But anyway, today we're going to do a fun episode, but what I'm hesitant to do. I've been asked a lot over the years to do certain things. And if I'm not knowledgeable enough about it, I hesitate to take it on. My expertise is in the American record industry, especially in light of the jazz age, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I have some concepts in the 70s and 80s as well, but I get often asked to do European jazz. And I'll be quite honest, I don't know enough. I want to still tackle it, but I'm going to tackle it with two caveats. A, I'm no expert here, and I'm going to appreciate some feedback from especially Europeans. And if I don't mention your country's biggest jazz stars, and again, we're talking from the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, not the present. If I don't mention someone from that era, please comment and fill it in for us, for me. And the second caveat is the lens of what I'm going to share with you in terms of the European jazz player is going to come very much from the American jazz record industry perspective. So that means artists from Europe who ended up licensing stuff for release in America or came over here and recorded here. And the other way that it kind of works is sometimes a lot of black American jazz players went to Europe, and sometimes they were recorded with white European sidemen, who there was plenty of. And all of them are great players, across the board: Denmark, Sweden, England, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany. There was all these countries had great players, and most of them are going to be anonymous and obscure here in America completely. And most countries have about 2 or 3 to a half dozen people that made that transition and became popular in America. And again, we're talking jazz, and we're talking the tail end of jazz. So by popular in America, it's a very there's a reference thing there. You know what I mean? We're not talking popular like the Beatles and the Stones, but we're talking in terms of jazz. Some of these guys had some appeal and caught on here to some degree. And some of the guys from Europe that got licensed and distributed here remained pretty anonymous. And I'll show you some stuff. So what I'm going to show you, country by country, is the European jazz cats that, like I said, had records put out in America. And sometimes they were recorded in Europe, sometimes they were recorded domestically, and sometimes they were recorded in Europe with black players. And I might have missed some guys. I put a couple hours on researching, pulling records out yesterday. I got a nice little swath of stuff here, but I know I missed some stuff, no question about it. I didn't do as deep a pull as I do for some episodes. And again, I'm not claiming to be an expert here by any means. But the nation that made probably the biggest impact here in America is probably England, which, makes sense in terms of, the language and just the amount of communication that happens between England and America. So it's a pretty obvious connection. We're going to start right here with Annie Ross. And she makes quite a few records, Annie Ross. And I didn't even realize she was born in England. And we're not going to do too many of these where they were born in England or Italy or someplace like that, like George Washington, and moved to America when they were still very young. This is going to be one of the few exceptions. I only pulled one of her records. She has quite a few records, especially if you factor in Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. which I love those records, by the way. But she's a great singer and a real jazz voice, and one of them clever, uh, cheeky singers of that era. And it turns out she was born in the United Kingdom. I did not know that. So, next guy we're going to talk about here, pardon me, is Marion McPartland. And Marion is a great piano player. These are two Savoy 10 inches that she records for Savoy in the early 50s. The magnificent Marion McParland, with fairly anonymous players behind her, Mousy Alexander on the drums. This is Don Lamont and Eddie Safransky on the bass and drums. Those are a bit more household names. I know Safransky played with Stan Kenton for quite a while. She's a great player, and she has a fairly large body of work, actually. And by no means did I pull all of it. It didn't seem necessary. What I did pull from her was those two 10 inches